It's build day and the FC1 from Pilot-RC has been sitting behind me for way too long. So today is day one of the build. Starting the build with the wings. Unlike most jets which have the landing gear in the nose and one in each wing, the FC1 has all three landing gear in the fuselage. So we just need to install two servos to complete the wings. And if we flip this over, we can see that the control horns come pre-installed. We'll be installing our aileron servo in its hatch here, and then the flap servo simply goes into the first rib. Should be nice and easy. Having learned from my J10 and Lizard how important it is to save weight, when choosing servos for the ailerons I went with the MKS HV1220, which is basically the same servos that I have in my J10. Why? Because sure, they're 23 kilos, but they're about 30 grams lighter than every other servo out there. So multiply that by as many servos as the plane has, that makes a big difference. The kit comes with these brackets to attach the aileron servo to its hatch. However, even though they look rather strong, they are made out of plastic, and I'm not too keen on plastic parts in planes. Now, I want to build this thing so as it can last basically forever. Optimistic, I know. So I'm going to replace these, probably unnecessarily, with a metal version, which I'm going to make with some aluminium L-bracket. Now, even though a bit more work than the originals, which just screwed in place with wood screws, I've had to use nuts and bolts, and here we needed to make sure to leave enough gap between this nut and bolt and the head of this bolt, because otherwise the nut itself is too tall to fit in the gap, which is why I've had to put it in upside down. And even this is my second attempt. But it gives me a lot of peace of mind knowing that no matter how many flights I put on this plane and this servo is not going anywhere. It was also nice to see that included in the kit are all the wire looms needed for assembly, including some 2-to-1 wires for the wings. So we have ailerons and flaps going into a single multiplex style connector, which is really nice to see that included. So just plug in the servos and we're good to go. Now in my case, sure, I'm sponsored by Powerbox, but we're also building this light. So I'm actually going to use my own homemade wires with the same principle, 2-to-1, but this time we're using the Powerbox wire, which on average is around about 30% lighter than standard wires. So every little gram helps. And a quick reminder just to center our servo before attaching it and screwing it in place. Just make sure that everything's working. There we go. That's nicely centered. We can now attach our servo arm and install it in our plane. With all our wires connected, it's time to close up the hatch. So we're going to drill out the holes a little bit first with a smaller drill bit than we need for our screw. That way we don't break any wood when we attach it. And personally, before doing that, I'm going to add a little drab of CA just to make sure that the screw really tacks into that wood. And that'll be secured there permanently. As much as I would have loved to use the same servo throughout and save weight on every servo, the flaps on this plane are huge and you can get massive deflections from them. So the 23 kilos probably weren't going to cut it. That's why instead I'm going to be installing the MKS HBL 550s with 38 kilos of torque, so we're able to crack out the flaps basically whenever we want. Not many secrets here, we just need to screw this servo in that hole. The only thing that I'm doing my own little way is that, as I've done for years now, I always replace the servo screws for these ones with an Allen head on the top of them, simply because they're a lot easier to install, they don't fall off the end. And I've always got these from modelfixings.com in the UK, which is a bit of a pain now that they're out of Europe and you have customs and so on, but worth it nonetheless. And with those 4 screws installed and a couple of accessories, that's now our wing finished. Now I've installed the Pilot-RC aluminium servo arms, specifically the 1.2 inch versions, and as you can see I still haven't had to use the furthest hole on it, and the same applies to the flap horn. Why? Well, I haven't needed to. Even with that position we already have probably more deflection than we need, and if we were to use the further hole it's just going to lose some torque on the servo, so best keep it as close as possible. On the aileron, on the other hand, we have had to use the furthest hole because here, because of the different position and geometry, we likely will need basically all of that deflection at some point or other. For anyone building this same plane, out of all the push rods that are included in the kit, the ones for the flaps and the ailerons are both 10cm versions, so roughly 4 inches. And this is what our two wings look like, ready to go. All we need now is the rest of the surfaces and the fuselage. Time to get cracking. The fin and rudder are very straightforward, as we only need to install one servo, and we already have our control horn installed by the factory. And the rudder servo just nicely slots in its little hole down the middle there. For a servo, we're going to be using the same MKS HV1220 that we used on ailerons, nice and lightweight, and rather unusually, we're going to be installing a receiver in the rudder. We may be used to installing two receivers in the nose of the plane, around about here, right next to each other. But being realistic, what's the point? If one receiver loses signal, chances are the one that's right next to it will as well. I mean, the antennas can only go so far apart. So let's make the most of the distance in this plane and have one receiver all the way at the nose and the second receiver all the way at the back in the tail. And we can do all of that without the need for two separate wire looms, one for the receiver and one for the servo. How though? Well, we start by connecting our receiver to our power box as usual, albeit with a much longer wire. Now on this occasion, because the rudder comes off obviously, we also need to put in a separate connector. So rather than using a Futaba connector, I've gone for the Powerbox 1-for-1 connectors because they have bigger pins, you can't put them in back to front, and you don't need a safety clip. So in my opinion, they're far superior to a standard Futaba. On the other side of the receiver, we have our servo, which doesn't need to be a bus servo. Why? Because the data or fast track output on our Powerbox receivers can be changed so that it's a normal standard servo signal. How? Well, we just go to our radio, access the receiver menu, and the data out, we change it from SRXL to PWM, which is a normal servo signal. And we change what channel we want it to be. So output 1 or say 2, which is where I have it programmed as at the moment. So in functions you can see I have my rudder as servo number 2. So now we have a fully functioning rudder and receiver connected to our power box all through a single wire. And with all of that tucked away inside the rudder, it all looks something a little bit like this, where we have our servo tucked away at the back with another one of those Pilot-RC 1.2 inch aluminium servo arms. Just in front of that we can make out our receiver, which just above it you have one aerial facing upwards, so that's on one side of the fin. On the other side of the fin we have the other aerial facing forwards, so that's two different sides of the fin and two different angles for absolute best possible signals, all coming out through a single wire to that 1-for-1 connector. 95mm push rod, and even with that short servo arm we're still getting significant deflection. Perfect. So that's one rudder ready to fly. And with that we've finished installing servos into flight surfaces, because we've got both our wings and our rudder. The elevators on the other hand, they're full flying elevators, so there's no servos in them, and the servos are actually in the fuselage, which we'll look into a little bit more in day 2, along with the vector thrust pipe and everything else in the back of the plane. We want to make sure we get things in the right order. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope to see you again when we continue this build. Let me know any comments below and I'll see you all in the next one.